My brother treated his son's ADHD like a discipline issue and left him covered in bruises. When I took him in, things got worse, until I sent him back. The next day I got a call from the hospital that changed everything. My brother Jake is the type of person who would miss his son's baseball championship because he was too busy networking at a conference. So, when his son Ethan was born, I made it my mission to be present in his life. I had my own son around the same time, so I always hoped they would grow up as best friends. I treated Ethan like he was my own. When he called me at 15 asking if he could stay with us for a while, I immediately said yes. Ethan arrived at my doorstep with tears streaming down his face, his eyes so swollen I could barely see them. The moment I embraced him, his crying intensified. I invited him inside and grabbed a pint of his favorite chocolate ice cream. Experience had taught me that pushing for answers would only make him withdraw, so I let Ethan take his time while I gently patted his shoulder. Without warning, he pulled up his sleeves, and what I saw made my stomach turn. His thin arms were covered with fresh bruises. I forced myself to remain calm, knowing I needed to be strong for him. This seemed to help him collect himself. "Uncle David, did you really invite me because you wanted to see me?" His eyes suddenly flashed with anger, and I noticed his knuckles turning white from clenching his fists. "What? Did your father tell you that?" At 15, Ethan was old enough to hear the truth, so I asked what really happened. It turns out his relationship with Jake had deteriorated significantly when he turned 12. That was when Ethan was diagnosed with ADHD. Instead of supporting his son and accepting him, Jake tried to discipline the condition out of him. Ethan told me that whenever his father caught him fidgeting or losing focus, Jake would shout directly in his face. Recently, Jake had bought noise-canceling headphones, not to help Ethan concentrate, but to block him out completely when he became too much to handle. I struggled to hold back tears as Ethan shared this. Before me sat a bright, creative boy whom the world and his own father had treated cruelly. I didn't know exactly what to do, but one thing was certain. There was no way Ethan was returning to my brother's house. I promised he could stay as long as he needed and handed him my laptop so he could order fidget toys and any other items that might help him focus. I could tell he appreciated it because even through his tears, the corners of his mouth turned slightly upward. I had no idea this was just the beginning of our challenges. At first, Ethan was quiet, staying in the guest room most of the time. I figured he needed space to decompress, so I didn't push. My own children were confused about why their cousin wasn't interacting with them as usual, but they respected his privacy. Then small incidents began happening. My youngest, Sam, came to me one morning with a scratch on his arm. "Ethan pushed me," he whispered. I tried talking to Ethan about it, but he just stared at me with empty eyes. "I didn't do anything," he said flatly, and I convinced myself it was just a misunderstanding. But the incidents continued to escalate. One night, I heard a scream from the bedroom. I rushed in to find Ethan standing over my daughter Emma, who had a bloody nose. Ethan was breathing heavily while Emma looked up at me terrified. I took Ethan to the living room and tried to remain calm. "What happened?" I asked. He merely shrugged, seemingly unaffected by what he'd done. I was torn between wanting to protect him and needing to keep my children safe. Over the following weeks, Ethan's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. He would yell at ordinary household noises, throw objects when my children laughed too loudly, and once pulled Sam's hair so hard I had to separate them. I tried to be patient, truly I did, but my children were becoming afraid in their own home. After another outburst where Ethan threw my wife's favorite vase at Emma and nearly hit her head, I called Jake. I couldn't handle it anymore. I was desperate. He answered immediately. "What has he done now?" When I explained everything, there was silence on the other end. Then he laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Of course he's acting out. He always has been. He gave himself those bruises, you know, and that whole ADHD thing, he exaggerates it for attention." I was stunned. Could I have been so easily fooled? The next morning, I sat Ethan down. "Your dad is coming to get you. I think it's best you go home." He didn't cry or yell. He just walked out the door with his backpack, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen anyone look. I spent that night questioning if I had made the right decision. The next morning provided my answer when I received a call from the hospital. Ethan had attempted suicide. I collapsed to the floor immediately. Jake was a monster, and I had sent Ethan back to him. I rushed to the hospital in a complete daze. My wife stayed home with our children, and I kept repeating no, no, no the entire drive. The hospital parking lot was a blur. I think I parked across 2 spaces, but I didn't care. I just needed to see Ethan. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I nearly fell getting out of the car, my body moving faster than my mind could process. At the reception desk, I could barely form words. "Ethan, my nephew, suicide attempt. Where is he?" The woman looked at me with practiced sympathy and asked if I was immediate family. I just nodded, not wanting to waste time explaining. They directed me to the pediatric ICU on the 3rd floor. The elevator ride felt endless. The antiseptic smell made my growing headache worse as I fidgeted impatiently. When the doors finally opened, I saw Jake sitting in the waiting area, scrolling through his phone as if he were waiting for a business meeting, not sitting outside his son's hospital room after a suicide attempt. I wanted to grab him by the collar and demand how he could sit there so calmly, but I didn't. I walked past him without a word and went directly to the nurse's station to ask about Ethan. Jake didn't even look up as I passed, his manicured fingernails tapping away at his screen. "He's stabilized," the nurse told me, her voice gentle but professional. "He took a large amount of pills, but they pumped his stomach in time. He's sedated right now." The nurse, whose name tag read Karen, had kind eyes that provided the only warmth in this sterile environment. I asked if I could see him, and she hesitated, glancing over at Jake, who was now watching us with narrowed eyes. "Only immediate family at this time," she said apologetically. Jake walked over, suddenly full of fake concern now that someone was watching. "I'll let you know when he wakes up," he said with artificial sweetness. "You should go home to your kids." He placed a hand on my arm that looked comforting to anyone observing, but felt ice cold through my sleeve. I wasn't leaving, not a chance. I planted myself in that waiting room and told him I'd stay all night if necessary. He shrugged and returned to his phone. We sat in silence for almost 2 hours before a doctor emerged and said Ethan was awake and could have visitors. Jake stood immediately. "I'd like his uncle to come too," he said, surprising me. "They're close." The words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd calculated exactly how to appear like the perfect accommodating father. The doctor nodded and led us both to Ethan's room. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Ethan looked so small in that hospital bed, connected to monitors and an IV. His face was pale, and his eyes were vacant. His usually vibrant brown hair lay flat against the pillow. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes. Relief, perhaps? When he saw his father, that flicker vanished instantly. The doctor explained that Ethan would need to stay for at least 72 hours for psychiatric evaluation, standard procedure for suicide attempts. Jake nodded along as if this were routine, taking notes on his phone like he was in a business meeting. When the doctor left, Jake immediately started in on Ethan. "What were you thinking?" he hissed, keeping his voice low. "Do you know how embarrassing this is? Everyone at the firm will think I'm a terrible father now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious right now?" I snapped. "Your son just tried to take his own life, and you're worried about how it makes you look?" My voice echoed off the sterile walls, and I noticed Ethan flinch at the sudden noise. Jake turned to me with ice in his eyes. "You don't know anything about our situation. You've always thought you know better, haven't you? Always trying to take him from me." His words were razor sharp, practiced barbs he'd clearly used before. Before I could respond, a nurse came in to check Ethan's vitals. Jake immediately switched to concerned father mode, asking questions about Ethan's care and recovery. The performance was sickening. When the nurse left, Ethan spoke for the first time. His voice was raspy and weak. "I want to go home with Uncle David," he said, not looking at either of us, his fingers picking nervously at a loose thread on the thin hospital blanket. Jake laughed that same cruel laugh I'd heard on the phone. "That's not happening. Your uncle doesn't want you. He sent you back, remember?" He said it with such casual cruelty. I couldn't take it anymore. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," I said, moving closer to his bed. "I made a terrible mistake. I should have believed you. I should have protected you." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away slightly, his trust in me clearly broken. Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. "We need to talk outside," he said through gritted teeth, his nails digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. Once we were in the hallway, he dropped the act completely. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Ethan is my son, mine, not yours. He's manipulating you, just like he manipulates everyone. He's sick in the head, and I'm the only one who knows how to handle him." I stood my ground. "He tried to kill himself because of you," I said. "I'm not letting him go back to that." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Jake's face hardened. "You have no choice. I'm his legal guardian, and if you try to interfere, I'll make sure you never see him again. I'll tell everyone you've been filling his head with ideas, encouraging his behavior. Who do you think they'll believe, the father or the uncle who's always been jealous of me?" His smile was venomous, confident in his power. He had a point, and he knew it. I had no legal right to Ethan, but I wasn't giving up. I went back into the room while Jake stepped away to talk to the doctor. Ethan was staring at the ceiling, tears silently streaming down his face. "Ethan," I said softly, taking his hand, "I believe you about everything. The abuse, the ADHD, all of it. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you before." He turned to look at me, his eyes full of pain. "You sent me back," he whispered. Those 3 words felt like a knife to my heart. "I know," I said, my voice breaking, "and I will never forgive myself for that. But I promise you, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get you out of there. I just need time." I squeezed his hand gently, willing him to believe me. He didn't respond, just turned his face away. I couldn't blame him. Why should he trust me now? The next 3 days were a nightmare. I visited the hospital every day, but Jake was always there, watching our every interaction. Ethan barely spoke. The psychiatric evaluation determined that he was at risk and recommended outpatient therapy. Of course he was at risk. He was living with his abuser. When Ethan was discharged, I made one last desperate attempt to convince the hospital staff that sending him home with Jake was dangerous. I told them about the abuse, the bruises, everything Ethan had told me. They said they'd note my concerns, but without evidence or Ethan speaking up himself, there wasn't much they could do. I watched helplessly as Jake led Ethan out of the hospital. Ethan looked back at me once, his eyes pleading, before they disappeared through the automatic doors. I cried the entire drive home, pulling over at one point because my vision was too blurred to continue. When I arrived, my wife took one look at my face and just held me while I sobbed. I told her everything, the abuse, Jake's threats, how I'd failed Ethan. She listened without interrupting, then said, "We need a plan." Her calm determination was exactly what I needed. We spent the next few days researching child protective services, legal guardianship, and documentation of abuse. I called Ethan several times, but Jake always answered his phone, saying Ethan was resting or not feeling well enough to talk. Each excuse was delivered with barely concealed satisfaction. 5 days after Ethan was discharged, I received a text from an unknown number. "It's Ethan, using friend's phone. Dad took mine. Please help." My heart leaped into my throat. I immediately texted back, asking where he was and if he was safe. He said he was at school, but would be home soon. Jake had been worse since the hospital, watching his every move, screaming at him for the smallest things, threatening to send him to a special school for problem kids if he didn't act normal. I told him to hang in there, that I was working on a plan. I asked if he could document the abuse somehow, pictures, recordings, anything. He said he'd try, but was scared of getting caught. A few months later, I received another text from the same number. "Check mail tomorrow." That was it. I barely slept that night. The next day, I immediately checked the mailbox when the mail arrived. Among the bills and advertisements was a small padded envelope addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a USB drive and a note that simply said, "Password, Baseball 2009. My hands trembled as I held the tiny device. I plugged it into my laptop and entered the password. It opened to reveal dozens of files, audio recordings, photos, and a Word document titled Read First. The organization was meticulous, showing a level of planning that broke my heart. The document was a letter from Ethan explaining that he'd been secretly recording his father's outbursts for months using an old phone Jake didn't know about. The photos showed bruises on his arms, legs, and back, each labeled with dates. Some were faded yellow, others vivid purple, forming distinct finger marks. The audio files had descriptions. Dad screaming about fidgeting. Dad threatening special school. Dad telling me I'm faking ADHD. I felt sick as I clicked through everything. The recordings were worse than I could have imagined. Jake's voice distorted with rage, screaming things like, "Stop that fidgeting or I'll break your fingers," and "No one will ever respect you if you keep acting like a freak." In one recording, I could hear Ethan crying softly in the background, while Jake ranted about how embarrassing it was to have a son who couldn't even sit still for 5 minutes like a normal person. The most recent recording was from just after the hospital. Jake could be heard saying, "If you ever try that suicide stunt again, I'll make sure they lock you up in a real psych ward. One where they use restraints." I was physically sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up. This was my brother, my own flesh and blood. How could he be this monster? I copied everything to my computer and made another backup. I called my wife at work and told her to come home early. The urgency in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness, because she said she'd leave immediately. When she arrived, we went through all the evidence together. It was overwhelming. There was no question now. Ethan needed to be removed from that house immediately. "We should go to the police," my wife said, her face grim as we listened to Jake threatening to slap the ADHD out of Ethan. I hesitated. What if they don't do anything? What if they talk to Jake and he convinces them Ethan is making it all up? He could destroy the evidence, make things even worse for Ethan. We debated for hours before deciding on a two-pronged approach. Contact CPS with copies of the evidence while simultaneously consulting with a family lawyer about emergency temporary guardianship. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day making calls. The CPS worker sounded concerned, but warned me that the process could take time. The lawyer was more encouraging, saying the audio recordings were compelling evidence that could support an emergency order. I felt a glimmer of hope until I received another text from Ethan's friend's phone. 911, Dad found out. Freaking out. Locked in bathroom? My heart stopped. I told the lawyer I'd call back and immediately dialed 911. I explained the situation. My nephew was in danger, his father was abusive, he was currently hiding in the bathroom. They said they'd send officers right away. The drive to Jake's house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. When I arrived, there were already 2 police cars in the driveway. I ran to the front door, which was open. Inside, I could hear shouting. I found everyone upstairs. Jake was screaming at a closed bathroom door, while 2 officers tried to calm him down. When he saw me, he went ballistic. "You?" he shrieked. "You put him up to this, didn't you? You've always wanted to take him from me." He lunged toward me, but an officer caught his arm. One officer stepped between us. "Sir, please calm down," he said to Jake before turning to me. "And you are?" "David Reynolds, Ethan's uncle," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The other officer was knocking on the bathroom door. "Ethan, it's the police. You're safe now. Can you open the door?" There was silence, then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened slightly and I could see Ethan's terrified face. His cheek was red, the beginning of a bruise forming. When he saw me, he flung the door open and ran straight into my arms, sobbing. He clung to me like a lifeline, his entire body trembling. Jake lunged toward us, but the officers held him back. "He's lying!" Jake screamed. "He makes things up for attention. He hurts himself and blames me." I held Ethan tightly. "I have evidence," I told the officers. "Audio recordings, photos, everything. He's been abusing Ethan for years." The next few hours were a blur of statements and questions. The officers separated us, placing Ethan and me in the living room, while Jake remained in the kitchen with the other officer. Ethan showed them the bruises on his arms, fresh ones, from that day when Jake had grabbed him after discovering the recordings. The officer photographed each mark, his face growing grimmer with each shot. I explained about the USB drive, the suicide attempt, everything. One officer made a call, and soon a woman from CPS arrived. More questions, more statements. Ethan was incredibly brave, answering everything clearly, despite his obvious fear. Finally, the CPS worker pulled me aside. "We're going to remove Ethan from the home temporarily," she said. "Given the evidence and the immediate safety concerns, we believe it's in his best interest. Would you be willing to take him?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "That's all I want." They gave us 15 minutes for Ethan to pack some essentials. I helped him gather clothes, medications, and a few personal items. He moved mechanically, as if in shock, carefully selecting items that clearly had special meaning. A worn baseball cap, a journal hidden under his mattress, a small box of trinkets from his desk drawer. Jake watched from the doorway, his eyes cold. As we were leaving, he grabbed my arm. "This isn't over," he hissed. "He'll show his true colors eventually, and you'll see I was right." I pulled my arm away. "Get help," I told him. "Seriously, there's something wrong with you." I meant it sincerely, despite my anger. The person my brother had become was unrecognizable to me. The drive home was quiet. Ethan stared out the window, clutching his backpack. Finally, I said, "I'm so sorry, Ethan, for everything. For not believing you, for sending you back there. I will never forgive myself for that." He turned to look at me, his eyes red from crying. "You came back for me," he said softly, his hand reaching out tentatively to rest on mine for just a moment. When we got home, my wife had already prepared the guest room with fresh sheets, clean towels, and new pajamas. My children were confused and a little scared, but they were kind to Ethan, giving him space but letting him know they were there. Sam offered his favorite action figure for comfort, a gesture that brought the first real smile to Ethan's face. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a beer, trying to process everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "You'll regret this." I didn't respond. Instead, I went to check on Ethan. He was asleep, curled up tightly under the blankets. For the first time in weeks, he looked peaceful. I knew this was just the beginning. There would be court dates, interviews, evaluations. Jake wouldn't give up without a fight. But looking at that text, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. I was doing the right thing, finally. The next morning, I woke up early and made waffles, Ethan's favorite. He came downstairs looking hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was really welcome. I pulled out a chair for him at the table. "Welcome home," I said, placing a stack of waffles in front of him. For real this time. He gave me a small smile, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough.